we get illy. Tough like South Philly. Got the cold steel, it's about to get chilly. Major figures like Gilly, I'm an outlaw kid Billy. How the fuck am I funny? You'll get slapped silly. Learn from the OGs, respect what you're shown. Real stand-up guys like Sonny Mazzone and Joey Merlino. We bring beef like Tino. Steak out at your house with a hidden name Nino. I know the gutter real well. My dudes coming through with that gunpowder smell. If you can't tell, I enjoy hell. G's moving silent, you'll never hear me yell. Stand-up guys,
you're a good debater and you're not afraid of a fight. So why have your comments off? Just out of curiosity.
Well, I've turned them on for a lot of things.
On your shorts you do.
Right. In some of my lives I think they're on, but almost as soon as I turn them on, there's photos of my family's homes,
okay.
What's the address, and at what point, and I just want to clarify,
please.
I don't have to take that abuse.
Agreed.
Like, I don't come to work and slap the dick out of their mouth.
Kind of why do you have a disdain for informants in your opinion?
I don't disdain them, I downright fucking hate them. Okay. That's okay. But see, this is why I can say it. That Jeff's crazy, he's on medication. I have a disdain for them because no man should ever go to prison on the words of another man, number one. Number two, in 90% of the cases you look at, the informant has done more vile and disturbing crap than those that are being accused. Number three, I find it oxymoronic when a man, Joey Merlino, because everybody knows who he is, he goes in front of a judge, they can bring up everything he's ever been accused of, including murders and whatever else. Even though he's acquitted, it doesn't really matter because it's a character judgment. But yet in that same case, you can't turn that around and say, well, let's judge the rat. Judges don't allow that. So for me, it's like you're walking in, you're already behind the eight ball.
And now it's time for Mob Talk Radio with your host, Jeff Canarsie.
All right, and welcome to Mob Talk Radio. Merry Christmas to all of you. I wanted to get this out tonight, and I didn't want to do it live. So I'm hoping all of you sort of enjoy the show. And we are going to be talking about something, I think, that nobody has ever really talked about before. So I'm going to pull this up really quick. Let's see if this will pull up. All right. We are going to be talking about the power transfer from Carlo Gambino to Paul Castellano. And there's a lot of things that I think get misconstrued by content creators like myself, pundits, authors, and documentary makers. And so I wanted to sort of do a dissertation on this tonight, and we're going to talk about some things that some people may not like. But as always on this show, the one thing that I always try to do is educate you a little bit. So when we dive headfirst into organized crime, one of the less often talked about topics is the power transfer from one boss to a new boss. In many cases, usually the power transfer is seamless. It's a seamless transition from one man to another. And in the majority of cases, or even when you look at balancing and transferring, you can investigate that on your own. You can look for reference points. But it's rare for a new boss to completely drop the ball. But there are cases like that. Usually what works for one traditionally will work for the other if you follow the example set before you. And I wanted to bring up an example of this. So let me just pull this up really quick because we're going to be talking about this for just a couple of minutes. And one of the examples that I often reference is sort of the power transfer from Tommy Gagliano to Tommy Lucchese. And that's really one of the best examples that we can sort of talk about. And in the case of the Lucchese family, this example shines bright. Thomas Gagliano, who at one time was not the boss of a family, moved against the code. At the time of at the time that family had huge issues. The family was embroiled in the Castellano War. And at the time, Tommy Gagliano, Tommy Lucchese, and Steve Rondelli were the toughest and most powerful members of Tommy Reina's crew. Joe Masseria had demanded more kick-ups from the crew, and Reina had refused. And then what Reina does is he surreptitiously switches sides to the Maranzano faction of the war. And when Masseria finds out, Reina gets clipped in February of 1930. And after Reina is essentially mowed down, Masseria names Joe Pinzolo the head of that crew. But Gagliano, Lucchese, and Rondelli hated that idea. To them, it was just another Masseria bootlicker. It also didn't help that Pinzolo was an outsider to the group. And it's been said that Gagliano and company wasted no time in getting rid of the interloper, and Pinzolo gets clipped in September of 1930 at an office that's actually leased by Tommy Lucchese, which was the Brokaw building off Broadway. And so, as we know, Gagliano would be named the new head of that crew. And after Luciano moves against both Masseria and Maranzano, Gagliano is named boss of his own family. And one of the things that Gagliano does is he moves their businesses to the Bronx, and he begins to expand into other rackets that one might not actually expect. Gas rationing, unions, and ice routes. He just overtook everything, and he did it very quietly. In 1928, he organizes the Plasterers Information Bureau in the Bronx, which was really the first infiltration into the unions. He was the first to do it. Any contractors who didn't join up got a special visit, and after a few words, joined. And if they didn't, they regretted it. He then completely absorbs the Lathers Union, pilfering off $500,000 a year off that union. And what he did was he simply took what Tommy Reina had done, and he expanded it in a way that was silent, small, and stealthy. Gagliano knew in order to succeed, one has to lay low. And he put out basically Tommy Lucchese front and center to run the day-to-day activities. And this is why we don't know much about Gagliano until he passes away. And even his death date is subject to debate. Excuse me. So when Tommy Lucchese takes over, he follows the path that's set before him. He doesn't change much, and he molds himself like Gagliano. And while Lucchese was not as sort of far back into the shadows as Gagliano was, what Lucchese does is he moves further into union control, but he doesn't overexpand. Think of a rubber band. You're only going to get to the point where you can take so much friction before it snaps. And all Lucchese does is stretches the rubber band. And of course, like I said, he moves the needle a little bit, but not to the point where it would become a problem. He followed the success of Gagliano, and he keeps it on course. However, when Tony Ducks becomes the boss of the crime family, he goes completely out of bounds and overextends everything, making himself and his crime family an immediate target. And then he ends up getting the commission indicted because of his mouth. Had he just stayed the path, had he just pulled that rubber band a little bit, he would have been a huge success. But instead, with that comes epic failure. And the reason why that lesson is so important is because the power transfer from Gagliano to Lucchese was a great success. Trafficante Sr. to Trafficante Jr. was a huge success. Most of the successful power transfers happen because the guy coming up the ladder has paid close attention. And he understands what works, and he understands what works best. It's those men who are greedy, the men who deviate from that path, are the ones who fail. And that's what brings us to Paul Castellano and Carlo Gambino. So let me pull up this thing real quick. Guys, are going to get a history lesson today, let me tell you. All right, let's go back to our notes here. So what we historically know, okay, we understand how Carlo Gambino becomes the boss. And for the sake of time, we're not going to go through all of that because everybody's talked about it. I've talked about it. But the one thing that you might not know is that the Castellanos were already big-time gangsters in New York before Carlo even arrives in this country. They were already established. And Carlo would simply work his way up within the crime family, eventually taking over as boss. And we know how he did that. And it's not necessary to go through all of that for what we're actually talking about. Now, Paul Castellano in the early days was not what many people believe he was. Castellano was not some soft pushover at all. And a lot of that has been distorted by the media, by informants, by book authors, people like me, content creators that don't know the difference. And in his early days, he broke heads and cracked legs with the best of them. He was no softy. When he was 19 and he gets arrested in Connecticut for robbery, he clams up. He keeps his mouth shut. He takes his pinch and he refuses to talk to the cops under any circumstances. And that move gives him credibility among his peers. And he ends up going to prison, I think, for 3 months to cool his heels. And people forget that he was a capo within the Anastasia crime family. And that's no small task considering Anastasia was a brute in what we know about him. In order to be a captain in that family, you had to be somebody. Prior to that, he was an active soldier in the Mangano crime family. People seem to believe that Paul Castellano sort of went from soldier to boss, and that's not how it went. He worked his way up and was acting boss on the streets when Carlo Gambino was the boss of the Gambino crime family. So all of this stuff of, well, Paul was just a nobody and just took over as boss because of his cousin-in-law / brother-in-law, but that's not true. He was the acting boss on the streets for years. Obviously, as we know, Castellano was caught at the famous Appalachian meeting, and he refuses to utter a word again, and he ends up doing a year in prison for refusing to answer a single question to authorities. He then gets a 5-year prison sentence for contempt for refusing to utter a word. Now, while that was overturned, he still refused to utter a word. And so what ends up happening is people lay this claim that at Paul's feet, that he was more of a businessman than a gangster. And while that may have been the evolution of where he ended up, that's not how he began. He earned his right to advance. And as you rise in those ranks, the less violence you have to do because you've earned that right. And people don't seem to ever mention that. Now, Paul would use his illicit gains to infiltrate the poultry market, Dial Poultry specifically. He used his acumen as a butcher and a businessman to infiltrate that business, and then he uses the power he has within organized crime to control 300 butchers in New York City. He forced Key Foods and Waldbaum's to take his products or else. And that's as criminal as it gets. These were things that Paul did prior to Gambino's death. Isn't the prime objective to legitimize yourself, to hide your money? I don't understand why that's sort of a knock on Paul Castellano, because like those before him, it was the same model. I mean, is somebody going to tell me that Profaci moving olive oil is a soft move, not what a gangster does? Are you going to say that Tommy Lucchese owning legit enterprises is a soft move? That it's somehow not being a gangster? That's what gangsters do. So a lot of Carlo's ability to stay off the radar, the ability to stay cloaked, was because of Paul Castellano. And Carlo had a system in place where Paul ran the streets for him. Carlo never uttered a word at meetings. All of these people that say there's wiretaps with Carlo talking, it's nonsense. It didn't happen. Most of Carlo's success post-1961 is directly because Paul Castellano was able to help insulate Carlo from everyone else. It's not like Paul was some clumsy lackey fuck who just suddenly got the seat on the throne. He was running the family. Carlo didn't frequent social clubs, but Paul did, despite people saying that he didn't. He actually did. Paul was visual. So a lot of the questions, surrounding Paul Castellano has more to do with Neil Dellacroce. People tend to have a bias against Paul based on what John Gotti thought or what they think John Gotti thought. But do any of us sitting here really truly know those reasons? And that's I think a question sort of worth asking. We're going to show another screen here. Pull up Mr. Gotti. So if people are already slanted to believe certain things, Paul wasn't a gangster. Paul was a straight up gangster. He was a feared guy. And a lot of people use Neil getting passed over as sort of the crux of the issue between Gotti and Paul. But Neil got passed over because Paul was the acting boss of the crime family for over a decade. He was the acting boss on the streets. And so even if you just looked at the hierarchy structure, Neil was just the underboss. It would have gone to Paul. The acting is above the underboss in rank, depending on what family you're in, because that could be subject to interpretation. Also adding to that, the bloodline here, because that was the one throwback that Carlo Gambino believed in, family above all else. And while it is true that Gambino didn't completely trust Neil Dellacroce, Paul was the rightful successor. What also is true is that Neil could have taken that decision to the commission, and he could have fought and says, no, I should get the promotion, and here's why. But he was in prison at the time, and he also wasn't the type of guy who was going to create friction where there wasn't. And that's exactly why Paul names Dellacroce his underboss, because that smooths over anybody who has discontent. Paul also handed Dellacroce half of the family's criminal rackets to run. Paul wanted to focus on the financial fraud schemes, the stock dumps, and stuff like that. He leaves the grunt work to Neil Dellacroce. And that's a smart move because Paul's acumen determined that he was better suited to work financial schemes, and Neil was better suited for more traditional rackets like bookmaking, loan sharking, and more. And so as the family began to expand into concrete and other rackets, what Paul does raises eyebrows. And as we know, the Concrete Club was founded, and he selected members to be on that club, and they would control contracts between $2 and $15 million. In return, the contractors would get a kickback of 2% of the value to the Concrete Club members. However, and we know this because Tony Corolla bitched about it, Castellano was taking more like 10% of the kickback, which was much more than the rest of those in the club were getting. Castellano also demanded more kick-up from his own men, and that's the difference between Carlo and Paul. Carlo didn't need to be greedy. There was enough to go around, but for some reason, Paul Castellano wanted more. And the move began to rub just not his own men wrong, but it also began to rub other bosses wrong as well. And the fact that Castellano controlled every inch of concrete on Staten Island, that wasn't enough for him. When he moves to control and ultimately does control the Teamsters Local 282, that infuriates the apple cart because that union is the union that poured all the concrete on Long Island and New York City. And what Paul was doing was monopolizing the industry. Others on the commission felt that his 2% kickback, at least on paper, was just for visuals, and they knew they were getting ripped off. Carlo likely would have been similar in that approach, especially cornering the market. But I think Carlo would have realized that the hand in the cookie jar would upset others. And while business is business in the streets, and what's fair isn't organized crime, there's also a business side to rackets where you don't make yourself a mark. And Paul didn't care. He wanted it all. And because of the ebb and flow in politics, Castellano began to corner the market on narcotics. And as we know, he allowed members of the Gambino crime family to move narcotics, but only in New Jersey. He didn't want to be attached to narcotics in any shape or form at all. And this is why there was leniency in New Jersey. And it wasn't in New York. It was in New Jersey. Go ahead and do it there. So when Gravano tells you guys the rule was we don't sell drugs, that's bullshit. Angelo Ruggiero and Gravano himself, were selling narcotics. Danny Marino, a whole bunch of these guys were involved in narcotics. And those are just the facts. And Angelo Ruggiero was probably the most egregious of that bunch. And it's not that Paul had an edict against narcotics. He wanted it controlled from outside the city. And it's a situation similar to Angelo Bruno in a sense. Bruno had his hands in the cookie jar and wanted it all for himself, but didn't want to let his own men earn because he knew a drug pinch was bad. And so Paul sitting here monopolizing everything in the city with an overbearing fist. And that's how dissension and desertion in the ranks begins. So that transfer of power from Carlo to Paul was meant as a way for the family to keep moving in a forward projection. But Paul's vision for the family was greed. And those are just the facts. And the reasons, as we said before, why we brought up Gagliano to Lucchese to Tony Ducks was because Lucchese followed a plan. And he just edged themselves out far enough not to make waves, whereas Tony Ducks went fucking insane and tried to monopolize every inch he could take to compete with Paul, which is what would lead to the commission case. And at the end of and it would also end the heyday of the Mafia. Succession is only that. If you move slow, you're okay. If you move too quick or you're too aggressive, it's lights out. It's like Carlo Gambino driving a ship and being okay with getting to Spain in 6 weeks. We'll get there, no worries. Under Paul Castellano, he basically adds a jet engine and would shoot any motherfucking ship in his eyesight to plunder. And taking all of that into context, the transfer of that power from Carlo to Paul should have been seamless. The roadmap was there, but there are those who saw the earmarkings of Napoleon rather than Alexander the Great. So the question is, where did Paul go wrong? Well, Paul makes 3 very, very, very big mistakes. And let me go back to this really quick. Oh, if I can grab this. Let's see. We're going to go back to that photo. I like that one better. Okay. So like I said, Paul makes 3 big mistakes. The first mistake that he makes is the monopolization effect on everything. Sometimes a percentage of 100 rackets is better than 100% of one racket. It creates instability. It creates jealousy and creates what I like to call Kennedyism. Joe Kennedy wanted everything, right? He wanted to control every single thing. And he wasn't afraid to do whatever he had to do to control that at any cost. Had Joe Kennedy been a bridge gapper, had Carmine Galante been a bridge gapper, both would have had a very different ending. Kennedy would have become president like he wanted to. Joe Kennedy. Galante would have absorbed the bananos and had no problems moving forward. But the penchant for grabbing all the toys in the sandbox creates disdain. For Paul, it was no different. The second mistake he makes is being greedy. And yeah, that goes hand in hand with monopolization because the ends really are the same. It's the same device. Politically, it's the same machination, 100%. However, further pushing your men to pay more creates disdain. And the third and fourth mistakes that Paul makes are congruent to his own demise. And number 3 and number 4 are drugs and murder. Now, Angelo Ruggiero made a ton of mistakes. Number 1, he was pushing weight. He was in John Gotti's crew. Now, we can dispute whether John Gotti knew about that or not. But the reality is I wasn't there. You weren't there. And it's been my belief, just because of what I know and being around people, most guys don't care where the money comes from and they don't ask questions. Where'd you get that from? They're not going to ask that. They're going to take their money and they're going to walk. Ruggiero from day one was being wiretapped out of the gate. Not only was that narcotics indictment going to affect Paul down the line, but the sheer amount of vitriolic things that Angelo Ruggiero said about Paul and other crime bosses would further agitate and impugn a sitting boss. And because John Gotti was the captain of that crew, he was going to pay for Angelo Ruggiero's deeds. It's the way the streets operate. I'm not saying it's right. That's how it operates. You are responsible for what your men do, whether you like it or not. And he knew that. Murder. Now, we're going to come back to drugs in a few minutes. The other mistake that Paul makes is the Westies and the DeMeo crew. And if we take a quick step back, Mickey Spillane had run Hell's Kitchen for years. And he was unwilling to cut the Genovese crime family into the construction rackets there, specifically the Javits Center. Tony Salerno wanted a cut of the action, and when Spillane tells him to fuck off, Salerno would go to the mattresses and kill off most of the Westies within a 6-month period of time. He then offers Jimmy Coonan a cut of that action as long as he goes along with handing over the Javits Center. Coonan goes along. Eventually, Salerno steps aside from Coonan, and Castellano, for some reason, wanted to bring the Westies under his control. And I think mainly that was to bring in outside hitters, but it was also to take a portion of their rackets. So Paul puts Roy DeMeo in charge of that crew. And the only rule the Westies had to abide by was no murder could take place without his permission, and in return, the Westies would be protected by the Gambinos and could earn under the Gambino umbrella. Now, the problem for Paul would be is that Roy DeMeo had absolutely no control over his own crew, let alone the Westies. And they began to exert their own prowess without regard for the rules. On the other end of that spectrum, DeMeo began the bloodletting all over the city, and the bodies were starting to pile up. And it was only exacerbated by the murder of the Cuban drug dealer by Chris Rosenberg, which in turn would lead to the murder of an innocent kid selling a goddamn vacuum cleaner. And it led to the Cubans threatening to come to New York City and whack everybody in the Gambino crime family. Paul has lost control of his own crews in many regards. A feared boss like Carlo Gambino would not have to remind anyone who he was, and he would have reacted swiftly. And I think that was sort of the edge on the streets for most guys. They felt Paul had lost control and was unwilling to kill someone, and they would only be half right about that. Had Paul realized what was happening, he would have acted, and he would have acted quick, and violence would have been on the menu immediately. But by the time everything comes to a head, Paul is in the Fed's crosshairs. He's got 2 indictments coming. He's fucked. That's the way things happen. So let's go back to the drugs for a minute. So when Angelo Ruggiero gets indicted, Paul requests transcripts, right? Ruggiero refused. Paul would apply direct pressure to Neil Dellacroce to get his hands on the transcripts and the tapes, and all Neil does is stall. And what nobody knew then is that Paul already knew what was said because he had the transcripts. But Paul was in a bad spot at this point because if he reacts violently now, facing 2 separate indictments, it's really going to be lights out for him. Paul was irate, and justifiably, he had every reason to be. And his options were severely limited at this point. He could kill John Gotti, and John Gotti knew that. Right or wrong, Gotti was the head of that crew, and therefore the damage had to spill over to him as well. Paul could kill Gotti, or he could dismantle the crew, or he could even shelve Gotti and throw him out of the mob. I believe, and I can't show you a piece of paper, but follow my logic, because it starts to make a little sense if you really think about it. I believe Paul Castellano ordered the death of Angelo Ruggiero, 100%. And I have every reason to believe that to be the case. Ruggiero was one of the only early reasons why Paul is having legal issues. And granted, there were other issues, but he's the one that started it. And drugs give you the most time. And murder, but time was on John Gotti's side, whether you realize it or not, because, how much we don't really know. Neil is sick with cancer, and any pressure that Paul is going to put on Neil is going to be mitigated by his illness and any indictments. And you forget, Neil Dellacroce was getting indicted too. He was going to be named in another indictment. If he doesn't get cancer, he's going to go away to prison the rest of his fucking life. So the boss is holding you responsible for your crew's actions. And you're going to be ordered to kill your friend, or you're getting killed, or you're getting shelved. And it's a situation where Neil could no longer protect John Gotti. And the evidence shows that in the wiretaps caught from Neil's own home, he's chastising both John Gotti and Angelo Ruggiero for their actions. And he's chastising them, explaining to them that they have no regard for the rules and they don't understand the life of which they have chosen. In one transcript, Neil Dellacroce literally says, and I quote, "You either do as the boss says or you go to war." And Neil is explaining the juxtaposition that Gotti finds himself in. The fact that Ruggiero somehow manages to live through any of this is insane to me. Now, people have often taken that wiretap and tried to parlay it into Neil agreeing with Gotti of, well, if you don't want to listen, kill him. That's not what Neil is saying. Gotti has two positions he can take. Do what Paul tells you to do, suffer the consequences, or go to war, and it's not going to end well. And they could only placate Paul because of his indictments. You know, it gave them time to think, to figure things out. Gotti's resolve was kill or be killed. And with the death of Neil, Gotti's protection is 100% gone. Not to say that Neil was totally protecting him, but he was insulating Gotti as much as he could. And that doesn't mean that he agreed with what John did or what John was doing. And it's my belief, and a lot of people are going to argue with me on this, that had Paul ordered the death of John Gotti, Neil Dellacroce would have killed John Gotti without a hesitation. I don't care how close they were. I don't care how aligned they were. That is the streets, and that is reality. Neil would have killed him if he was told to do so. Bottom line. And anybody that says anything different doesn't know the streets. Okay? Your best friend in that life will fucking kill you. Most of Paul's demands of Neil were tests to see if Neil would play ball, and he didn't. And there is no reason for Paul to ask for the tapes from Neil when he already has them, unless he's testing the resolve of Neil Dellacroce and John Gotti. So Paul's mistakes in not keeping a firm grip on his own men and focusing more on legit enterprises is blinded by his ego and part greed. He puts himself in the situation by not keeping a firmer grip on what is going on. And one could make the argument that Neil being a complete street guy also led to Paul's demise as well. It shows while Paul and Neil might be aligned on certain things, they were totally different men. Paul had worked his way out of the trenches and Neil loved the trenches. Two very different men. And I don't honestly picture Neil saying, no, you can't earn doing this or that. Paul, you know, so Neil's perspective would have been, do what you got to do, make your money, I don't want to know. Whereas Paul was a little different. Two different men. And so Paul tries to clean it up by ordering the death of DeMeo, but the damage was already done. Ruggiero, Montiglio, Nino Gaggi, Jimmy Coonan, Tony Ducks, they all buried Paul Castellano. And the true insulation of a boss only works if you are justly insulated and you rule with an iron fist. Paul's ideology of the Corleone crime family just doesn't work in all reality. And what made Carlo Gambino so successful is being able to pull the trigger. And his men feared him without him having to utter a word. That's true fear. Paul was not a soft guy, but he loses touch with the reality of where he got and how he got there and why. And when you rely on others to run your businesses, you become out of touch. So as we know, with Gotti backed into a corner, he reacts, and the rest is history. John Gotti can only do what he does because others on the streets knew Paul was going away. And the one thing that they feared most of all was that Tommy Bellotti would take over and act complicit as an emissary to Paul, and that many lives would be in danger as a reaction to Paul's sentence, which would have been life without parole. It's trading one for the other. It's taking one Napoleon and adding another. And many think that it was, you know, many think it was Gotti putting control back in the hands of the real gangsters. But reality is, it was a self-survival move more than anything for Gotti. And perhaps historically was actually the most honest and accurate reason why Gotti makes that move. Look at his history here. Others before him made that claim that they were defending themselves, but it was all bullshit. Anastasia, Genovese, two examples of that. Gotti reacted out of fear, and in the history of organized crime, it was an honest reaction. And probably the truest reaction that we've ever seen when it comes to a hostile takeover. Kill or be killed. And as we've seen historically, the correct transfer of power, new bosses have the respect of their men. They have been in the trenches. They have earned their stripes. Men who take it by design often do not have a very successful run, because how you take that position in life is how you end up in that life. Live by the gun, die by the gun, right? That's the old saying. A true power balance, or a true succession of power from one man to another in the truest form, is someone who sees the model, tweaks it a little, and keeps the ship on its course. Those who come to power and attempt to seize, to steal, to pilfer from the chest are quick to surrender, get killed, or lose it all. The men who come to power that forget how they got there are left solitary and without the support of those who can insulate them best. Carlo Gambino's name instilled respect, fear, admiration. While his roadmap certainly was one of scheming and betrayal, he was a success because once he reached the summit, he knew how to be fair. He knew how to conduct business. Men who don't want to share, men who are derived solely based on money and not principle and not longevity, are quick to the guillotine. And that's just the truth. That is the absolute God's honest truth. And that is exactly why the transfer of power from Carlo to Paul didn't work. And there's been a lot of guys whose transfer from one to the other didn't work. So it's my hope that you learn something tonight. Because a lot of people say, oh, well, Paul just went from being a whatever to the boss. No, he was an acting boss for 10 years. He handled the day-to-day affairs. This is a guy in his youth murdered. This is a guy in his youth cracked heads. This is a guy who ran numbers for his father in his teens. This is a guy who had acumen. But Paul's biggest acumen, his biggest asset is being a financial schemer. But his biggest detriment is he forgets the business that he deals in. And that's what happened to Paul. And it's not about what's right, what's wrong. Paul was this, Paul was that, because a lot of people, when they talk about Paul, have a tendency, and I've been guilty of it myself. So don't think I'm not being a hypocrite here. A lot of people have a tendency, well, Paul was greedy. Paul wasn't a real gangster, didn't associate with anybody. Listen, there's a lot of things Paul did right and a lot of things Paul did wrong. But make no mistake, Paul Castellano was a feared individual. And the proof is John Gotti killed him. You kill someone that you fear. And John had every reason to fear him. And there may be those that are going to come along and say, well, John Gotti was afraid of nobody. Well, he was afraid of Paul. He's the boss. Anybody in their right mind would tell you they were afraid of Paul. Everybody should fear a boss. If you're not feared, then you become yesterday's newspaper that everybody steps on and you line the cat litter box with it. Paul was a feared guy. And if Paul had ordered the death of John Gotti, he would have been killed. 100%. But he doesn't, because he's in the position now where what good does it do? I'm probably going to go to prison the rest of my life. And that also leaves Paul subject to being blind and not seeing it coming. And that's just the reason why it didn't work. And it's been that way for a lot of crime families. But there's also been the flip side of that. You know, if we look at the Patriarchas, good example of that. Ray runs the family perfectly. Son takes over and all goes to shit because he wasn't strong. He wasn't strong enough. Gagliano to Lucchese, perfect. Carlo, Tony Ducks, comes in and oversaturates everything. Gets pissed about Castellano putting his hand in the cookie jar and gets everybody indicted. He wasn't the sole reason, but he was a reason. And that's the last thing I kind of want to say is this, that there is a tendency from commenters and commenters, people in the chats, people that cover content, is the thing that they always use to sort of poke at John Gotti. And I'm not defending John Gotti. The thing that they use is, well, he got caught on wiretaps. Every boss in history, just about, has been caught on wiretaps. He wasn't the only one. He also wasn't the only one that killed a boss to take over. Luciano did it. Carlo Gambino did it. Anastasia did it. Genovese tried to do it. So you cannot hold the torch to one person's balls and not hold everybody else accountable for the same thing. This is organized crime. This is what they do. Good, bad, and indifferent. But you can't use that to try to impugn somebody or to give them a negative attribute when everybody before them did the same fucking thing. What was the difference between Luciano killing Maranzano and Masseria versus what John Gotti did? What was the difference? What was the difference between Carlo Gambino and and Genovese getting together to kill Costello and Anastasia? What is the difference? What's the difference between Joe Bonanno trying to hit every member of the fucking commission with Joe Magliacco and Joe Colombo? What's the difference? People apply that where they think it fits. And that applies across the board. So, with all that being said, I wish you all a very Merry Christmas, a Happy New Year, and we'll see you soon. I hope you guys learned something from this show tonight. Be good to one another, find something to laugh at, find something to watch on TV, and we'll see everybody soon.